I'm Geoff Gee and welcome to the farm here at Risdale. This farm here, this land here, originally was a 84 acre block taken up by my grandfather under the Closer Settlement Scheme in 1928. Originally was an 84 acre block. This drain that we will see as the drain behind us was built after the 1934 floods, reduced this area of this block down to now only 56 acres. The back half of it is a little bit better in quality than the front half. It is on the most northern extremities of the Kooyarrup swamp. Just only about a mile here is the most northern extremity of that swamp. It was one of the last areas cleared of tea tree scrub. When my father came here, he was 16 of course, and the land had been smashed down with a big contractor from the Closer Settlement Commission, and then the tea tree had to be ploughed out to what was left of it after it was burnt. So I remember my dad saying when he was 16, they had the old Twin City tractor, they started ploughing around and around the 84 acre paddock. The Closer Settlement had supplied them wheat seed and had to have a man on the back, Charlie Milligan, pushing the tea tree roots out as the disc plough was jamming it up. And there was 300 acres up to the road and back. There was the last area cleared. So I guess that means that it was of a bit lower grade than the rest of the Kooyarrup swamp. So over the years, my father milked cows later on. Prior to 1937, my grandfather had a chaff cutting business on the Kooyarrup swamp. By the late Depression years, the demand for chaff was dropping off a bit as a few tractors were starting to appear and the demand for horse chaff wasn't as great. They decided to get into dairy farming in a bigger way, and by 1940 they were milking 60 cows by hand in the shed at the house, including using this land here. Dad met Mum in 1944 and they eloped and got married, and Dad settled down at a block they had at Delmore, Dad and Mum, for 3 years till I was coming, and Dad and Mum then moved to Risdale here to the house, and my grandfather and grandfather moved down to living in the shed down at Delmore. Dad still was milking cows, but they didn't have the milk contract at that stage. Sheep prices improved a bit, so they jumped across to sheep at a bad time when the wool was £1 a pound. That didn't work out too well, and then by about 1953, my grandfather, Dad and my uncle had separated their businesses. They each took 120 acres of land, and Dad decided to have to get back into milking. Dad slowly built up by supplying extra milk over the autumn period. That helped you to get an increase in your milk contract, which was of course a better price per gallon than milk at butterfat prices. Slowly he built the contract up to 50 gallons, which he had then, and by 1968 cousin had planted some lucerne only about a mile from here. Dad thought, oh, maybe we could give it a bit of a go, and I said okay, and so the paddock, which is just up here, he sowed that in 1968. Back in those days, the variety was Hunter River. So we sowed, that was the only variety you had in those days. So we sowed the Hunter River, and it sort of went all right. Dad had the old hammer mill, because he used to hammer mill oat and hay for feed the cows in the cow bale. We then started hammer milling the lucerne hay to feed the cows in the cow bale. He did make an odd sale, but at that stage it was only worth about, hay was worth about $1.80 to $2 a bale for lucerne in the paddock. We sold a few bales, but most of it hammer milled up for cow feed in the cow bale. And then that went all right. Then in 1975, my father died very suddenly, and I took over, kept the cows going, and times got really tough. And then the very next year, a insect come from somewhere, they say America, called the spotted alfalfa aphid. This aphid absolutely devastated the paddock. The paddock went, I think it was about in March, went from green like we can see here to brown just in the space of a week. And I'd read about the coming to Australia of the spotted alfalfa aphid and how the Hunter River variety was susceptible to that. So naturally, the Department of Agriculture were interested in those days to come and have a look. They came up and had a look, yeah, spray with pyramid, aphicides, this sort of thing. But obviously then the next step was introduce varieties from America that had resistance to the spotted aphid. So that paddock had degenerated a fair bit by then. So then I did sow then the first resistant variety, WL318. And then I got a new neighbour next door. There we put in Pioneer variety 542, which was stage 2 on the dormancy, which is really good. You know, unfortunately you can't get it now. The most dormant one I can get is Q31, which we've got up the paddock a bit. It's at what's known as 3 in the dormancy scale. I've found that the more dormant it is, the more it stands our wet winters here. So naturally enough, I don't have any cows on it in the winter. Well, I've tried different varieties. I'm always experimenting. I've harvested my own seed off crops that have been grown for about 4 years. My theory is that this has become acclimatised to the conditions at Rithsdale, and perhaps it's the ideal plant to plant. And so a couple of times I've sown my own seed that I've harvested from a crop that may be a few years old. I've been growing lucerne from 1968. We sowed this crop in November 1968, one crop. It lasts about, all depends. Sometimes there's a failure. I've had failures when I've sowed. It's just the crop has been a failure. Other times I've got up to 8 years out of a serviceable crop. For anyone wanting to grow lucerne, I guess the things I would think about is don't gamble the farm on lucerne. It's got to be a secondary crop to something else really, because you're at the mercy of weather, winter and summer. Winter it could get too wet, summer it can get too dry, and of course you can get rain events on and off all the time. So I hope to have the big hit. It's my form of gambling. I don't go to the casino, I've never bet on a racehorse, but I'm growing lucerne and even sunflowers. The first cut I usually take off for the last few years with silage. I sell that to a local dairy farmer. Silage is good because it doesn't need as much time to cure from when you mow it. You can bale that at far higher moisture level. So that gets that first cut off and gets your second cut coming. It's important, I feel, that your first cut is taken off in early October, middle October at the latest, to help you to get that 4 cuts a year. Yeah, we're standing in the 7-acre paddock here. This paddock was only baled last Thursday of Anzac week. That was the 6th cut here. It's a paddock now that's, this is its 5th year. It is starting to degenerate fairly bad here. Plantains are a bad weed in the crop, and Flaris tends to start moving in. Lucerne is a poor competitor for weeds, especially weeds that grow in the winter. Saying that, I would say that it's probably not a suitable crop for anyone in this district anyway to be growing as organically, because unless you've got a really clean paddock. I did harvest a very clean paddock on shares with a man on Island Road. That was an organic paddock, and it was pretty well weed free. I guess the farm's got a history of being weed free, but if you've got any sort of a weed seed bank in your soil, it's not a goer to not use herbicides. Just a requirement. Unfortunately, I don't like using chemical sprays of any sort, but I've been using them the whole time I've been growing lucerne, except for the first couple of years when we never even had a sprayer. Finally got one going out of a couple of 44-gallon drums and a 10-foot bit of plastic pipe stuck on the back of an old potato scuffler frame. But for the last 20 years I've had a much more modern non-ferrous spraying system. And my last 2 years I've got a poor man's light bar guidance working on GPS, which has been really great for me. I feel I'm good. I'd love to have auto steer, but as my dear old friend said, you have to crawl before you walk, so you can't have auto steer straight away. With a nice crop is the best thing to have. It will shade weeds a bit, and of course everyone wants a nice crop. It's hard to get, but if you can get a nice crop and a good stand, they say you're supposed to have 3 plants per square foot, or nowadays it's 600 stems per square metre. so which we've probably got here. There's no weed trouble here, and this hasn't been sprayed here since last spring. In a stand here of it's Hunterfield and Aurora variety. This could be cut now for silage, but I've decided to leave it go. I feel that by letting it go as it is now, the crown will build up really strong for next year. So I'm already looking at next year's crop here. Some of it's really good there. That's, I don't know whether we can see there, but that's quite big a leaf there. If Mick can close up on that, see the big leaf. It's I'm really happy with the stand that it is here. But of course Lucerne, a little bit like asparagus, has to build up in its crown during the winter with food in the crown. I don't know technically what it is. I guess it's carbohydrate build up in the root of the plant to sprout out for the next season. So I'm looking at perhaps a good year next year from this crop here. A time of the year now where we could get a bit of lucerne flea as it starts to cool off in the autumn. I've never worried about lucerne flea because this crop here, I'm not worrying about it too much because it's just going to go dormant through the winter. If you cut early, like I said before, to get that first cut off in early, even in September if you could, the hay will be gone. The sun can beat in, and when where the sun can get down near the ground, it seems to burn out those little insects, lucerne flea and red-legged earth mite. Sometimes on the mower cutter bar, you see little pea aphids and other small little insects. I wouldn't worry too much about insects. I don't like using insecticides much. The other thing is to get the good crop, which helps for insects or weeds. Everything's better if you can get a nice crop, just like what we've got just here. I don't get it very often, but this is really good here. It starts off with lime. You've got to have a reasonable sort of a pH. And in this very paddock here, I can well remember way back, it was probably about 1970, my father was still alive, we got some lime put on because we'd heard lime was good for lucerne. That spreader truck went around and around. He did this paddock in 2 parts. Well, later on that year, you could see a distinct line where that spreader truck went for about, there was a 2-yard strip dark green, then there was a 2-yard strip that was a much lighter green. So obviously you could easily work out that right behind the spreader truck, the lime come out thicker, and out a yard each side and more, it wasn't as thick. So there was a distinct trail of that truck in that whole paddock of lime, and so from then on I knew that lime was an important ingredient for growing lucerne. Lime must be fine to neutralise that acidity, and to work quick it needs to be very finely ground lime, so very dusty, and it must be incorporated in the ground by a rotary implement. So following me reading that, most times that I've sowed, I've had a ton of lime put on and always asked for dusty lime, and then rotary hoed that into the ground to try and incorporate it down to about 6 inches below the ground level. They say you should have a pH of 6.5. Most of it here, I think it's about 6 or something like that, but it originally was about 5.5. I've had tests done right down from the top foot, which is about 5.5, down the second foot, same, even down to the 3rd foot. So it's fairly homogeneous right down to the clay at about 5.5 here originally. And I suppose now the top, we've improved the top a little bit with liming. I don't think there's much you can do about it well down underneath, but as we know, lucerne's deep rooted, and it's so it is ideal if you had land closer to neutral, but there's not much of it in Australia. Just here in this paddock, we can see how it's important that your paddock does drain reasonably well. There's a little low spot through here, and about when the new crop was only about an inch above the ground, we got rain and there was a water line on the top here for longer than a fortnight. And unfortunately, there's the population of lucerne plants here is quite low, and with other weeds like sedge have moved in here. I did try to drain it, but obviously my spirit level eyes weren't good enough, and I've left a little wet area just here. So one of the things is you must have drainage so that it doesn't be surface water for more than 2 weeks. Ideally, you don't want any surface water anywhere, but I guess it's the same as any sort of pasture. So it will survive better than ryegrass underwater, but it will still succumb. We've got a bale here in the back of the ute that I baled only about 3 or 4 weeks ago. I've had a lot of trouble this year with the weather on getting reasonable hay. I feel this is my only cut of what I would call chaff and quality hay. It's important when you're baling to still have the leaf. Now we can see the leaf just there. I think I baled this at about 11 o'clock at night. It's important to bale when the air's at the right thickness so that the leaf, which takes up moisture out of the air through hygroscopic effect, and then toughens up. If you bale in the heat of the day, that leaf there will be quite dry, and so you can put it in your hand, squeeze it, and it's all left on your hand. When you're ready to bale hay, you should be able to put it in your hand and squeeze it, open up your hand, and you don't have a handful of crushed up leaf on your hand. What I've found over the years, and most of my life, because my father was an agricultural contractor from when I was a little boy, but with hay, and especially now with lucerne, you don't know exactly when you'll be raking it or baling it for hay. Mowing's okay, you can mow it at any time, but the raking and baling has to be done with the air at the right thickness, and so you're not sure when that is. It has to dry out, you have to know that it's dry, you have to be able to scratch your stem with your fingernail and no bark comes off, no cuticle comes off. You must have that moisture level down or the hay will wet.
We're about to take this shovel, and with all my strength I'm going to see if I can actually get a good spit of the soil with a little bit of this lucerne plant coming out of the ground. My shovel isn't exactly 3 metres deep, so it's not going to go right down to the depths of that. You can see we've actually severed the roots of the lucerne. It's still not far off a centimetre in thickness, and that's at a depth of about 150-200 millimetres. So it gives you an illustration of how deep the roots of that legume is going. I'm breaking up this pretty heavy clay soil to see if I can see any signs of the nodules on the roots of the lucerne. Now what happens, because we can see around the roots here, these little white spots here, are new nodules forming. Because we've had a number of cuts on the lucerne, after each cut we find a lot of those nodules are actually going to slough off into the soil, providing nitrogen as they break down for the corresponding crops that are there. So it's an amazing plant. When it's going down to that depth, it's bringing up a whole range of soil minerals up to the surface of the soil, where they're going to be recycled and become available for perhaps the next crop or whatever might be growing in the soil there. Well folks, what we're looking at the moment, just quickly, Geoff's talked a little bit about the use of lime on the property. Interestingly, tissue analysis of lucerne shows that it's obviously very high in nitrogen, between 3 and 3.5%, very high in potassium, 1.5 to 1.8%, and also very high in calcium. So if we know that that's the composition of the lucerne, then we go back to a soil analysis and see how we're dealing with those particular nutrients in the soil. The pH is actually around about 5.9, so it's classed as moderately acidic. Now what that means is that basically the calcium is just dropping a little bit, and there's certainly a slight deficiency in potassium, which is seen as a key element in the composition of lucerne. The cation exchange, which we've talked about previously, around about 21, illustrates the fact that it is a heavy clay. It's going to hold nutrients in the soil. One of the very beneficial things we're seeing here is the total nitrogen is around about 0.44%. Now that's around about double the background average level across Australian soil. So that's showing that the lucerne over the years is actually building soil nitrogen. And the nitrate nitrogen, which is one of the things that really sparks the growth of the plant, is up around 59 milligrams per kilo. That's pretty high. So we've got really good growth coming on here from those nutrients, and the only one I guess we perhaps could look at in the future is just a little bit more lime and maybe a little bit more potassium through. I would like to see perhaps potassium sulfate as a recommended fertiliser if Geoff's going to consider it. But all things are going pretty well on this stretch of land.
For the last 3 years I've once again grown some sunflower. I need to change crop in lucerne because you can't resow lucerne on top of lucerne. It's got autotoxicity where the lucerne plants exude pathogens to try and kill the plant next door. So you've got to leave it for a few months before you can resow lucerne. So the best thing is to have a different crop for 1 year. Sunflowers was the only thing I can think of, and I already had equipment required to harvest it. I still had my old sunflower trays for my header. and I thought I'll once again just try some sunflowers. I might be able to sell a seed to horse people, as I did sell a little bit in the past. But through a couple of friends, I discovered a firm that used sunflowers for birdseed mixes, and he was quite interested to buy it, and so that worked out quite good. And so same thing, he's still wanting a seed this year. In fact, there's quite a shortage of it. There's none available in Australia that he can find at the moment, and has to import it. So I'm just hoping that the weather holds and I can harvest this crop here. This is a crop of Aussie Gold 62. It's a higher lake oil sunflower. It's a newer variety. Older varieties had a high amount of linoleic oil, where that oil had to be hydrogenated to be used as sunflower cooking oil. Inside here is the grain. The problem with harvesting is we have the seed on the outside of the pad there. It's a little seed there. But inside the pad, it's a little bit like sponge rubber, and so it can get damp and wet. And so while I've been harvesting at the moment in another paddock a couple of miles away, we're having a lot of moisture trouble. It's still wet here. What I harvested on Saturday before the rain was running at 16% moisture. That is too high. For long-term storage, sunflower needs to be down to 9% moisture. So it'll have to be dried. That's another cost at the moment. But this is the thing, I don't know more rain, I don't know how to stop it. There's now no sunflowers crushed for oil in Australia. It's cheaper down to South America way. Argentina and Brazil can land it in Australia far cheaper than Cargill's can crush it in Australia. So there is a small birdseed market, and this is where this will go.